Welcome to the Free Will, Science, and Religion podcast. I'm Chandler Klebs, and I'm here today with George Ortega. And today we're going to discuss how the belief in a God that is omniscient and knows exactly what's going to happen in the future, how this kind of blows the idea of free will. This is an additional thing to the fact that we already have we have causality and acausality, which are both incompatible with us being responsible for our supposed choices. But religion has this additional thing where God can know exactly what's going to happen in the future, what people will do, and then can therefore prophesy. And so it's the idea of fortune telling and foreknowledge that is an additional problem. And I'm sure that George is familiar with this too, aren't you, George?
Absolutely. And, like some people will say, well, no, God's omniscience or all-knowing nature doesn't necessarily mean that we can't do what we want. And that's flawed logic, because like basically along with omniscience comes the attribute of infallibility. If God is infallible, in other words, if God is all-knowing, that means that God has to know everything. He can't be wrong.
Right.
So if you kind of like connect the infallibility attribute that has to go along with the omniscience, and you put them together, then you understand, yeah, if he knew a million years ago what was happening this very moment, there's absolutely no way that it can be different from how he knew it was going to be. And the other part, I guess, is if he knew it back then, the only way I think he could have known it would be that he would have to be responsible for having created it. I mean, like, what's your take?
Well, my take on this is several things. First of all, a common objection that I hear from people is that, well, God knows what our decisions are going to be and what we're going to do, but he doesn't cause us to do it. And there's a problem with that because, first of all, if you believe that God created you, whether directly or indirectly by creating your ancestors thousands of years ago, either way, God is the prior cause, perhaps even the first cause, according to your belief, of what you're doing today. And so you can't say that God didn't cause you to do what you're doing unless you are ready to admit that God didn't create you. So there's a problem there anyway. However, there's a second problem with this. First of all, if God does know everything and knows what you're going to do, well, how does God know what you're going to do? And there's the problem there, because if God knows that you're gonna choose to do this as opposed to that, well, God also knows the reason why you're going to choose this or that. So there's a problem, and because there is a reason, obviously, if you know all of the prior causes and all the reasons for a decision, well, then you know what the decision is and why it is. So really the fundamental reason why free will is impossible is causality. And so whether or not somebody knows your decisions are not free in the sense people think it is.
Yeah, and Chandler, I think like a lot of times when people consider this notion of omniscience, they relate it to us human beings. The example that they often cite as well, if a human being knows that, for example, the sun is going to rise in the east tomorrow and set in the west, does that necessarily have to happen? Okay, and the answer, if it's a human being, is no. Because we expect, I think, with 99.99999% accuracy that will happen, but we can't say that it's completely inevitable. But the thing is that we don't have, a human being isn't omniscient, so we can't, completely know what's going to happen in the future. But again, if God is omniscient, it's a very complete omniscience. And so again, like, it ties in with the concept of God's infallibility. God is supposed to be infallible. He doesn't make mistakes. So like, if God knew that we were going to do something, a million years after he knew it or whatever, and we did something different, then he would be wrong, and that's not possible. Now, all right, so you addressed this notion that I want to explore, Chandler, more about this idea that like God knows the reasons for why you do things, because you cited causality, but the argument that a free will believer could make is that, well, that and it doesn't make sense, of course, but they could say that, well, God knew that the cause of our decision was our free will. I mean, I realize it doesn't make sense, but
Yeah, it doesn't make very much sense because they have yet to explain how a free will decision is supposed to actually operate. And I think Trick Slattery had an excellent diagram of that. Did you see that infographic?
oh yeah, he does great graphics, absolutely.
Yeah, because nobody's is able to really explain how you can make a decision that's not determined by the prior causes and yet that you're responsible for. Because if it's not determined by the prior causes, well, then it's an acausal decision, a random just thing that you do something for no reason. And if there's no reason for doing it, then how in the world can you really, how can you be the reason? How can you be the cause? And
Exactly.
and then they do this thing, well, free will operates on the spiritual plane outside of time, space, and causality. And after that, I quit talking to them.
No, I know. And so, all right, our podcast yesterday, we dealt with that. In other words, like people are deciding whether we have a free will or not based on reason, not based on logic, not based on science, based on what they emotionally need to believe. Um, I posted a photo on Facebook recently that I got on my newsfeed. I shared it. It's like it had you might have seen it. It had an image of a woman, like a mother, I guess, telling her 4-year-old child, listen, if you don't believe what the Bible says, you are going to spend the rest of eternity in hell.
Yeah,
Okay, and like,
yeah,
yeah, so this, go ahead.
yeah. In fact, I saw that picture. That was what I was going to say.
Yeah, and so like, that it was citing it as an example of child abuse, which I think it is, but relative to what we're talking about here now is that it maybe explains why people don't get this very, very powerful, simple logic that free will is impossible, whether things are caused, whether things are uncaused. Any way you look at it, free will is impossible. These people, I think when they were very young, whether they went to Catholic school or whether they had religions, parents who told them that before they were able to think, because like, a 4-year-old doesn't have the capacity to really reason the way an adult or an adolescent would. And so like, I have a feeling that, in their unconscious is this deep-seated fear of hell, and that's what's preventing people from getting this.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right about that. Fear is such a powerful motivation that it really drives the majority of all human behavior, I've noticed, because it's people who challenged the church's teachings a long time ago, were condemned for heresy by the Catholic Church and executed and weird stuff like that. So there was that kind of fear, but any type of fear like that nowhere compares to the fear of hell. This fear that you're gonna suffer forever after you die. I mean, nothing could be as bad as that. And so,
Yeah, and go ahead.
yeah, and I know that fear very well because that's what I'd heard all my life. But then it really changed my life, and I thought, wait a minute, there's no way I could be responsible for what I believe or don't believe, because isn't my belief based off of the evidence as well as my intelligence and logical ability to look at the evidence and figure out what's true or not, So I stopped feeling responsible for my beliefs.
Exactly. And again, even with our intelligence, it's not something we get to choose how intelligent we are. I mean, our intelligence can increase over our lifespan if we study more and think more, whatever. But in general, even that's not up to us. one thing that's interesting about, fear, and we should, I guess, get back to the omniscience question, because it is good. We got to try to figure out a stronger case against the objections. I mean, I think when I usually present it, I usually present omniscience along with omnipotence. But all right, regarding the fear question, what's interesting is that the causality works both ways. In other words, like, the belief in free will makes people afraid makes people vulnerable, to believe that in a hell. In other words, like, if people believe in free will, then they believe that this idea of hell is justified, and that, creates the fear. And the opposite is that, like, when people believe in I lost this. I've been thinking too much. Basically, like, all right, the fear of hell prevents people from believing in free will, and the belief in free will prevents people from overcoming their belief in hell. I think I got it. Okay.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult to separate the beliefs because they can't really be separated. Because as you know, like, the whole system of a religion kind of falls apart as soon as you deny one central teaching. Like some people, I believe it was like Pelagius or somebody who denied the original sin doctrine, because I think Augustine came up with that. But then there's the problem is that the original sin thing was such a central part of the theology and belief that supposedly it was because Adam and Eve sinned that we got original sin, and that's why Jesus had to die. And so you can't just take one belief out and have the rest of it stand. It's a house of cards. But back to the hell thing here, yeah. Some people, they look at the Greek and Hebrew texts, that later became our modern Bible, and found out that the concept of hell taught isn't really biblical anyway. And so then they think, hey, this is great. There's no hell. Let's go tell everyone that there's no hell. And then you find out these people are mad that there's no hell. They want there to be hell. And I've never quite understood that. But it's people hold on to beliefs no matter how bad and painful those beliefs are. Can you explain that?
Well, yeah, and I think I can, to a certain extent. Basically, their belief that there should be a hell stems from their belief that there should be justice, and their belief that there should be justice stems from their belief in free will. And to explain that, the concept, the term free will isn't in the Bible. Greeks didn't have a term for either will or free will, and there's no term, free choice or free will in the Bible at all. There's choice, but nothing relative to freedom. The term was coined by Saint Augustine of Hippo, in about 380 AD, and he coined it in response to what you were referring to, this concept of original sin, of evil. He was trying to grapple with why there would be evil in the world. And like, his conclusion was, he was starting from the premise, well, God is all good. So if God is all good, now here's the thing. Augustine could have blamed Satan. Augustine could have said, well, God is all good, human beings are innocent, and evil is all Satan's fault. But instead of blaming Satan, Augustine chose to blame us. And that's how this whole concept of free will, pretty much came to be such an integral part in Christianity, and now in Judaism and the other religions. Basically, it was Augustine's answer to the question of why evil exists.
Yes, and aside from the fact that free will is a false thing, there are other problems with Augustine's reasoning. Because it doesn't matter, even if you blame the evil in the world on humans, or you blame it on Satan, if God created those humans or created Satan or whatever, well, then that doesn't make any difference. God's still responsible for being the first cause and for creating the creatures with free will.
Exactly. And a way to describe that is like, let's say a human being creates a robot. like this scientist, this genius scientist creates a robot, and through some magic powers, because it would have to be magic, and even magic wouldn't work because magic, there has to be a cause for it, but through some kind of means, this scientist endowed this robot with free will. Okay, so like the free will, the robot escapes of his free will, the lab, goes out and just wreaks havoc, just destroys a lot of things. All right, so like they finally catch the robot and they find out who made him. So then like the robot and the person are standing in front of a judge, you know, for the trial, for sentencing or whatever. Like now the question is who do we think this judge is going to indict and going to blame for the robot's behavior? The robot that did not create itself, or the scientist that created it?
It's so
In other words,
obvious, the scientist.
exactly. So like when we apply this reasoning to God, I mean, like, and what's also obvious, Chandler, is that like when we do good, it's a very, very common religious teaching that we should thank God, because if it weren't for God, we would not have been able to do that good. So that by that same reasoning, both because God created us and because God is all powerful, anytime we do bad, we could not have been able to do that bad without God making us do that bad. Absolutely.
Exactly. They try to flip flop. I call it free will flip flopping. They whenever good happens, then they give credit to God for creating them to be able to do good. But whenever bad happens, well, then the humans are blamed. But why not give God the blame too? And like, you got to be consistent. You really have to be consistent, because if God gets the credit for the good we do, then God also gets the blame for the bad we do, since he would be responsible for us for having created us.
Exactly. And I can understand how people would kind of like resist that kind of judgment of God, because it's kind of like it feels good to consider that there's like a deity, a God up there who loves us, is in all good and all. And that's I can understand the reasoning for it. And so like I've come up with a kind of a reasoning that can even absolve God of being evil, of doing evil. And I'm not sure it's completely satisfactory, but it does it goes into the realm of what is logical, and then what transcends logic. And what I mean by that is that like as far as we know, like the time regresses back to the Big Bang. That's the first known instance of our universe. But then logic tells us that, well, no, the Big Bang was in the beginning. There must have been something before that, and there must have been something before that, and like this regression, back into the eternal past, according to logic, doesn't seem to stop at any point. In other words, time seems to go back eternally into the past, there never being a beginning. And I think like we understand that like relative to God is supposed to kind of like have no beginning, no end, God being eternal. So that's the thing. So if God is eternal and if time is eternal, in order to blame God for any act of evil, we would have to come up with an exact moment in time where God decided, well, I'm going to cause this evil to happen. But if we have an eternal regress of time and an eternal God going back eternally into the past, never, reaching up that point, then by that reasoning, we can absolve God of any evil also, because there was never a point at which God decided that there should be evil.
Exactly, George. And this is something very interesting, since you brought it up, is see, I believe in the infinite regress, because it doesn't make sense to think of a first cause, because then I'm like, well, what caused the first cause? It's just, it does blow your mind either way, because to think of a beginning blows your mind, but for some people, an infinite regress, where things just go infinitely backward in time or infinitely forward in time, blows people's minds. And yet the reason that I found it more palatable, if that's the right word, I'm not sure, to believe that there is an eternal past, just like there's an eternal future, is because you know what? I already believed that back as a Christian. I was like that there was that that God had no beginning or end. But now I look at it, if you believe in a God that has no beginning or end, well then that means that there's no beginning or end, because if something always existed, whether that's God or the universe or whatever, then there was no beginning, there is no end, and so I think of like humans and other animals as the consciousness and the memories that they have as having a beginning and an end. But the universe as a whole and reality, no beginning or end. And so, yeah, even God couldn't have a free will to be able to choose free of prior causes if there was a God that was doing stuff. So, yeah,
X.
yeah.
Oh yeah, Chandler, you bring up a great point because, like, not only are we saying that human beings don't have a free will, we're also saying that God, at least in the present moment, doesn't have a free will either. Because you're right. Because you're right. Because like the way God is at this exact moment in time was completely dependent upon the way God was at the previous moment in time, and that state of God was dependent on what God was. In other words, yeah. So God is also subject to causality. God does things for reasons. There are causes even for why God does things, and I mean, the best that we could say is that God perhaps at some distant point in an eternal past, and again, we have to concede that it doesn't make sense, may have had a free will, gazillions of years ago, but because causality is not just a scientific material concept, it's also a logical construct that applies to everything, then God cannot have a free will now because, again, if God knew a million years ago what God would be doing today, even his omniscience, to get back to our original point, prevents him from doing what he knew he was going to do. Prevents him from doing anything different.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if God knows precisely what he's going to do or what someone else is going to do in the future, well then, does that mean God has the power to change it? Because if God knows something and then God changes something because he doesn't like the future that he knows will happen, well then that future doesn't happen, and so God just invalidated his own knowledge.
Right. So Chandler. So yeah. So I think like there's two ways of like using this omniscience attribute of God to refute free will. Yeah. The first is to tie it with the attribute of omnipotence. It's not just that God knows everything, and I think omnipotence works independent of omniscience. In other words, just the fact that God is all powerful means that like, if God doesn't want you to do something, you're not going to do it because he is all powerful. And if he wants you to do something, you're going to do it because he is all powerful. So that stands alone. But I think maybe the omniscience, the all-knowing attribute, needs to be perhaps paired up with the omnipotence attribute and also with the infallibility attribute. If God doesn't make mistakes, then you can't do anything but what God knew that you were going to do or not do.
Yes, it's very interesting how that works, because, and I've heard, the God doesn't make mistakes things, but then humans make mistakes. And so I look at it as a mistake for God to make humans who make mistakes. It gets really funny.
Well, Chandler, I mean, yeah, because I mean, like, Augustine came up with the concept of free will relative to, trying to figure out why there should be evil in the world. Now, we have to understand that evil, I think, is what we term to define that which creates pain, which causes pain. In other words, if an act didn't cause any kind of pain at all to anyone at any time, then I don't think there's any way we could like designate it as evil. And so this whole question ultimately revolves to the question of, well, why would a God, a loving God, a good God, create suffering, create even the ability for suffering? And that's something I've thought a lot about. I can't come up with a satisfactory answer. Just like, there's no, especially an intelligent God who was able to like create the laws of the universe, our brain, which is the most complex, structure in the universe, why would a God that intelligent, presumably that a good God, create suffering? It makes no sense.
Yeah, it makes no sense. And there's one other philosophical problem that really blew my mind that makes no sense. There's the ancient question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does existence exist? Why are we here? Why are we conscious? I mean, this is scary.
Yeah, Chandler, why is there something? And yet, like when you ask that, it's kind of like it's kind of almost impossible to conceive of there not being something, and you're right. I mean, just the fact that reality exists is a mind blower. I hear you.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting thing to think about because I listen to philosophy podcasts and read interesting topics of philosophy. Why is there something rather than nothing? The mind-body problem. Is there a soul or an afterlife? All these different things. I listen to like Philosophy Walk and I'm like, whoa, people have been discussing these deep questions that just hurt your brain when you think too hard about them. And I don't know what it is, but I enjoy it. To me, it's like a game. It's like a video game or something to ask these questions and try to figure out, well, what's right, what's true.
Yeah, no, I do too. I do too. And for example, with this question of why is there suffering in the world? I think we can tie this together with like why is there existence, and also like the logical fact that God or the universe is one. If God is everything, if God is everywhere, then God is all there is. I mean, everything is a part of God. I mean, that tends to be my belief. And so like here you have a God being, existing eternally as one. There's nothing else but God. And so like, and in terms of like why suffering exists, I hope this is not the case. I hope I'm wrong in this, but sometimes I kind of like think that, well, that can be a horrible state to be in. Very, very lonely. God existing eternally, just being one. And so that I think, maybe out of that suffering, out of that pain that God was experiencing, God just creates worlds like this, maybe being one of an infinite number of worlds God has created. And maybe our suffering reflects God's suffering of being in a sense condemned to be one, to have this solitary existence.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting because I know you're a pantheist where you kind of equate God with the universe. And what's interesting is before I met you, I'd never heard of such a thing, because I was always taught, well, God is outside of time and space, outside the universe. And I'm like, what? So because that was what I heard for well over 20 years of my life, I say I'm an atheist because, well, I don't believe there's something outside of the universe because that's outside of existence.
I agree with you completely. I hear you. All right, so we got a couple minutes left, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm not entirely sure about the time because it tells me how long it's been since the call started, which is 32 minutes about, but we weren't recording that entire time. But I guess we better close it up. Let's see.
Yeah, no, I started the timer as soon as you started, so yeah, we've got about a minute and a half left.
Okay, should I do the exiting or should you or?
No, go ahead. Just like we can wrap it up however we want.
Okay, yeah. Well, in the remaining time we have, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and perhaps something we could explore in a future episode is the problem of evil or suffering. Why is there suffering? Because I'm sure this is one of the biggest debated topics ever, and I think we can bring the topic of pain, the problem of pain, and how the avoiding pain causes us to avoid choosing certain things, displaying our lack of free will.
That sounds excellent. Yeah, because like I think, pain is actually it explains two things. In other words, like we are hardwired to avoid pain, and that makes free will impossible. But that's also a reason why people don't want to accept that free will is impossible because it's painful for them to make that realization. So I think you're right, Chandler. I think pain is something that needs to be really explored in depth relative to free will.
And it really does. And I can show people that you will actually feel less pain when you're no longer self-blaming for yourself for stuff you couldn't have done differently.
Well, yeah, we definitely have to talk about that. Absolutely.